So welcome to episode 6 of 10-Minute Record Reviews, and today I'm going to talk about the Blackbyrds debut, eponymously called The Blackbyrds. This is the original 1974 release of this album on Fantasy Records. It's jazz funk, pure and simple. It is very 1974. What you're going to get is funk rhythms with jazz improvisation on top. And it's a largely instrumental record. The vocals, when they occur, are mostly group. There's one place of solo vocals on the album, but otherwise this album is fundamentally about the instrumental music. What happens in the 1960s is rock and soul and R&B are taking market share. Jazz disappears into its own interest, let's just say, and it becomes very much musicians' music with the development of free jazz, spiritual jazz, and a lot of other developments which, while critically acclaimed, were eventually critically acclaimed, not originally, were as a consequence led to a really declining market share, because this was not music to sit down and listen to with mom and dad. This was not music to dance to. Jazz was now very much sort of headphones, sort of cerebral music, and a lot of black players noticed that they were, as a consequence, while they were pursuing very sort of political and profound and emotional and spiritual avenues, they were losing contact with their African American audience, which had been the core, the basis, the origin of jazz in the first place. So what happens in the late 60s is a number of players begin to move back into, I guess, more mainstream, more popular African American music, and so you begin to see a real fusion of jazz with soul music, with funk music, and Donald Byrd, who was a well-known hard bop trumpeter, starts to make this transition in the late 60s. He's derided for this transition by, established jazz critics who, just like they didn't like the new thing in the early 60s, they don't like jazz players flirting with popular music as they see it in the, as it's now seen. Of course, jazz was originally popular music, but flirting with rock and blues and R&B and soul and so on wasn't popular. But Byrd is undeterred, and he keeps going and going, and he also is a musical educator, and he's teaching at Howard University in DC at the time, and a number of his students are quite inspired by him, and he basically mentors them into forming this group, the Blackbyrds. So it's Joe Hall and Keith Kilgo, Kevin Toney, Barney Perry, Alan Barnes, and Perk Jacobs are the 6 that make up and there's a nice little photo of all 6 of them right there in the middle of, right there in the inner sleeve. Anyway, there are the Blackbyrds. Donald Byrd not in that photo, but he's very much present behind the scenes and all over this album. So the music is very much jazz funk music, and the point of that is that this is party music. It's not cerebral music, although there's lots of great sort of cerebral and highly proficient playing on this album. That's not the point. This is an album to put on and move your hips to and have a great time, and it really accomplishes that. No later than the very first track, which is a Donald Byrd composition, "Do It Fluid," which is terrific. This has got a wicked bass line. It's got everything you want from jazz funk. It's got hand claps. It's got a clavinet, which, if you're not familiar with clavinet, is that slightly nasally sounding keyboard, which Stevie Wonder used a lot in the early 70s, but it's very classic funk sound, and it's just got a great groove, an excellent song, and that mood continues to the next song, "Gut Level," which is more up tempo than the first song. It's got some great wah-wah guitar in it. It has some very jazzy synth lines over top, unless it is a melodica, which is also used on this album, and it's not entirely clear at which points it's used, but it's a melodica is a wind-blown keyboard instrument And anyway, there are some unusual sounds on this second song, and so that could also be the melodica. Then we're into Regins or Regans, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, and Larry Mizell and his brother Fonts at various points are kind of legendary figures in 70s jazz funk. They produce a lot of records and are also kind of involved as writers and collaborators and musicians as well, like in kind of in a Quincy Jones kind of way. All kinds of sort of seminal records all the way through the decade. And this is a Larry Mizell composition, and it's a little more down tempo. It's got a lovely little ringing guitar piece from Barney Perry. It has it also has trumpet and flugelhorn in there. Oscar Brashear, who's guesting on this particular track. It's got a very rich tone, so it's a lovely song as well. And so the tempo, although the tempo is varied through the first side, each of these songs is really quite good. And then the final song is on side one is "The Runaway" which is a co-composition of Donald Byrd with one of the band members, which again has got the clavinet opening, which I love. But the real star of this song is slap bass. And it's got some group vocals which aren't anything special. Most of the vocals on this album, you have to say, are not that special. This is not why you buy a Blackbyrds record to listen to the singing. Side 2 starts with another Donald Byrd song, and it's another great one. This is Funky Junkie, and it starts as much sort of slower groove. This is a 7-minute song. This is the kind of song, if you have a lowrider. I don't have a lowrider, but if you did, this would be a great song to play when you were in your lowrider. It's got a really great deep synth line that starts off with, which kind of playing off the bass at the same time. It's got some nice wah-wah guitar. The group vocal here is actually really quite good. It's very simple. It's just one phrase, "Lord have mercy," which gets repeated again and again to really good effect. And you hear this song and you realize why it was that Dr. Dre and the whole Death Row crowd, the people behind the sort of West Coast G-funk sound, were reaching back to the Blackbyrds and other bands of this ilk, to sort of find inspiration for their slower, sort of really sort of deep groove kinds of tunes. It's really super. There's also a great tenor saxophone solo in this by Alan Barnes. So really a wonderful song. Probably the best song on the album, I think. Then speaking of Alan Barnes, his solo composition is the very next cut, which is "Summer Love." Here he's playing soprano sax. I found this track, it kind of veers towards smooth jazz a little too much for my taste. Bob James and sort of latter stage Grover Washington, I think, would have been kind of proud of this song. I don't think that's necessarily an endorsement. But it's got Barnes is playing, although I'm not so crazy about the arrangement. The playing is lovely. He's weaving over top of a group vocal again, which is quite good. The last two songs, the second last song is a song by Larry Mizell. This is the second song in the album. This is not the stronger of the two songs. It's got a nice bass line, but it basically leads into some pretty phoned in jazz funk. So it's I think not particularly memorable. And then the album closes with a song called "A Hot Day Today," which is a co-composition with Byrd. Of the four Byrd contributions, this is the least strong of the four. It's an okay song, but I think it's Barney Perry who's singing, one of the group members, and he's not the strongest singer in the world. And I don't think I think they might have found someone different to sing it, or maybe just reconsider this particular song. It's just okay. This is a debut of a group that would go on to create some real high points in the history of jazz funk through the later part of the 70s. The songwriting from Donald Byrd and Larry Mizell provide most of the high points in the album. The songwriting from the band itself is not yet that strong. Again, these are still students at university, so it's not surprising that they're leaning more on established musicians and songwriters to drive this. It's not a flawless album, but it's got at least two really great funky tunes written by Donald Byrd that start each of the two sides. And this album is worth collecting for those alone. It's you know, significant for being the Blackbyrds' first album. It's not an essential album, but if you're into jazz funk, this is one you'll want to pick up. So for me, it's worth 3.5 stars. So for me, it's worth 3.5 stars, and it's an enjoyable listen.